Hi there, everyone. This is Joey Lindstrom over at the National Low Income Housing Coalition. Thank you all for joining us today. We have a really exciting conversation on housing providers and their role in election engagement. I am going to get right into it because I think we're starting a couple of minutes late and everybody had significant time to sign on. I'm going to do a quick check, though. I'm not sure everyone can see my screen. All right, I think we should be good then on screen sharing. And let's get started. So first, general logistics for the webinar. We will allow time for questions at the end of today's presentation. So if you have a question, please go ahead and use the questions box that appears in your control panel. The control panel is on the right-hand side of your screen, and you'll find the questions box toward the bottom. We will have access to a video recording and a copy of today's slides for all participants. This is a question that we often get. Many of you know that we have promoted this and our other webinars in the Our Homes, Our Votes series as a webinar and podcast series. This was supposed to be our first podcast this week, but due to some technological capacity issues, we went back to the tried and true webinar format. But you should know that because we prepared as a podcast, we'll probably have fewer visual slides today than you are accustomed to if you are a loyal viewer of the Our Homes, Our Votes podcast and webinar series. And of course, I expect that you all are. If you're having any technical difficulties today, please shoot an email to Brooke Shipwright at the email address on your screen, and we will try to address any audio or technical difficulties. If you've attended webinars in the past, you know that things get buggy, things get glitchy. So if you've got any concerns, please do let us know and we will address them very quickly. So agenda for today, we're going to do a quick review of the Our Homes, Our Votes 2020 campaign. And I'll provide just a quick update on presidential campaign engagement. We're going to announce something new, the Housing Providers Council, and then we'll talk about some best practices, and I'm going to bring in some guest presenters to talk about what they've done in the past in terms of registering residents to vote, and then making sure residents get to the polls and get their votes counted. And then we will review the upcoming topics for webinars and podcasts in our series. So my guest presenters today, we are very lucky to have with us Kathy Alderman, who is the Vice President of Communications and Public Policy at Colorado Coalition for the Homeless. Her Twitter handle and email address are there for those of you who want to stay in touch. And we also have Andrew Foley, who is the Associate Director of Development for Jonathan Rose Companies, and his contact information is there as well. Okay, so I always do at the beginning of these webinars a very quick, 5 to 7 minute introduction of what Our Homes, Our Votes is. For those of you who might be new to this topic, we've been working on Our Homes, Our Votes for a couple of years now under that banner, but we've been doing voter engagement for many years, previously called it a voterization campaign. Our Homes, Our Votes has three primary components: registration, because we want low-income renters and their allies to be registered, but we want them to be informed voters, which is education, and making sure that voters know where to vote, how to vote, and where candidates stand on housing issues. And then thirdly, mobilization. Voter registration and voter education only makes a difference if people actually go to the polls on election day, or if they're getting their ballots in by mail or voting early. And we need voter turnout rates to increase among renters throughout the country. I should say that part of education in Our Homes, Our Votes is educating also candidates about housing issues and making sure they're aware of the concerns of renters in their community. We work on this for some obvious reasons, and some of you have seen this chart in our other materials before. There is a significant voting disparity between renters and homeowners. As you see on this chart, every federal election, we see a significant difference of about 20 points in voter turnout rates between renters and homeowners. And this disparity is even greater and more alarming when you look at it by income. When you look at severely low-income people with incomes below 20,000 and compare that to households with incomes above 100,000, we can see that wealthy people are turning out at much higher rates. It shouldn't surprise us then that so much federal housing policy is geared toward higher income homeowners than it is low-income renters. Our campaign is making a difference. We are relying on a lot of polling that we did recently through our Opportunity Starts at Home campaign that revealed things like what you see on your screen right now, such that 83% of the public agrees that elected officials are not paying enough attention to the cost of housing and the need for more housing. And 76% say they are more likely to vote for a candidate who has solutions on housing issues. For this reason, we have had some real success engaging the many presidential candidates who have been running in the primaries recently. And as a result of this, we have seen more candidates than ever before who have announced housing plans and housing platforms as part of their campaign. On the Democratic side of the ledger, we're at a place now where every major candidate, except for Joe Biden, has released a housing plan. And just this week, former Mayor Pete Buttigieg released his plan with greater detail than he had before, having previously released just kind of some outlines of a plan. But his housing plan is available. Those of you who want to review the various plans of the presidential candidates can go to www.ourhomes-ourvotes.org, and you'll see that there is a specific web page for each candidate where we post articles in which they've talked about housing, videos where they have addressed their housing plans, and any other materials that we have available from their campaigns. But one thing that I get asked a lot is which presidential candidate has the best plan. And I will say, any one of us might have different ideas on which plan is the best based on if there's a particular program that we love more than others. But the reality is all of the plans really are quite good. And as a result of this, we have a much stronger position heading into federal policy after the next presidential election. I'm going to do a brief pause to make sure that we are seeing the questions that are coming in. And so if everyone will give me just 10 seconds here. Okay, thanks everyone for that delay. Just wanted to make sure that we were seeing the questions and comments as they are coming in. Okay, so let's move on into our special topic today. I want to announce a project that we've been working on and that Andrew Foley and I have considered in conjunction with a lot of folks over at the National Housing Trust. And that is the development of a housing providers council within Our Homes, Our Votes. And so what this would be is a constituency consideration for this would be a narrow constituency of housing providers who are interested in the outcomes of the Our Homes, Our Votes campaign. Why housing providers? Housing providers are uniquely positioned to access low-income people who are renters, because very often renters are moving frequently. They might be behind locked doors of locked apartment buildings. They might be more difficult to access because they work non-traditional schedules and so forth. And for these reasons, low-income renters are often missed by traditional voter engagement campaigns. For this reason, having the housing providers involved and actively paying attention to the election and what they can do as their role is one key. So what we're working on at NLIHC is providing tools to make it easy for housing providers to be involved. And when you hear the term housing provider, I think many of you know, I'm really talking about landlords, right? The people who own and operate the buildings that renters live in. So this can be for-profit housing providers, nonprofit housing providers. This can be public housing agencies, homeless service organizations that do housing first or rapid rehousing. Anyone who provides housing, we are hoping to have them officially join our Housing Providers Council, where they are pledging to make sure that all of their residents are registered to vote and that all of them are making it out to vote. So what I'd like to do now is open up a conversation with our two guest presenters who have significant experience engaging on this issue as housing providers and have a lot of thoughts to share. Don't expect, as I mentioned earlier, that there are going to be really many slides for this portion. This is going to be a conversation as you might expect from a traditional podcast. So with that, I'm going to make sure, Kathy and Andrew, are you unmuted right now?
We are.
Okay, I hear you fine, Andrew.
I think so.
Okay, great. So I have, I think I'll start with Kathy Alderman. Kathy, as I mentioned, is the Vice President for Communications and Public Policy over the Colorado Coalition for the Homeless and has been leading their policy engagement for several years now and is the voice of their organization for conversations on their robust activities moving forward. So Kathy, why don't you start by telling folks what Colorado Coalition for the Homeless does in Colorado, what kind of housing you provide, and what kind of population you work with.
Sure. Thanks, Joey. Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. I'm Kathy Alderman. I'm with the Colorado Coalition for the Homeless, and we're an organization that has been operating in Colorado for about 35 years. Today, we own and operate 19 different housing developments where we house people both on the affordable spectrum, but also people who have come from a situation of homelessness or severe risk of becoming homeless. So we're housing about 2,000 individuals and families on any given night through our own properties. And then we also work with the local government, our state government, and the federal government to administer housing vouchers. So we work with families and individuals to find what we refer to as scattered site housing, and that's through relationships that we have with other landlords across largely the Denver metro area, but throughout Colorado to the extent we can. And we do administer about another 2,000 vouchers. So again, on any given night, we're housing about 4,000 families and individuals throughout Colorado. We try very hard to engage our residents, both in our properties and the ones that we're housing elsewhere, and participating in government processes. So we do engage in voter registration. We are right now doing census outreach work, trying to make sure that everybody gets counted for census purposes. And we try to engage our residents in participating in our advocacy efforts at the state capitol by testifying or engaging with media by telling stories about their transition from homelessness to housing or, the critical stabilization activities that have kept them housed that we're able to work with them on.
That's great. Thanks so much, Kathy. And may I ask, how long has Colorado Coalition for the Homeless been working on making sure that residents have a voice in elections? Is this a new project or something that's been ongoing for some time?
So it's my understanding that we did some voter registration back in the 90s, but I wasn't here then, so I can't confirm that. Since I've been with the coalition and I'm on my fourth year now, we started doing voter registration work in 2016. And that first year, we registered about 100 voters, both through some of our properties and through our delivery of healthcare through our healthcare center system. Last cycle, we were able to more than triple that, and we are registering about between 550 and 600 individuals for the 2018 election. We will begin our voter registration process this year in July, run that July through October. We would do it earlier, but because we're doing the census work, we didn't want to confuse folks about what they might be signing up for. So we're going to start our voter registration work in July this year and hope to continue to see increases in the numbers of folks that were getting registered and getting pledged to vote. Some some people might be registered, but they don't always follow through with participating in the election. And so we have them sign pledge to vote cards, which then kind of make sure they get the right notifications and that we can get them to the polling place if they don't use their mail-in ballot for that cycle.
Okay, that's great. Thanks for introducing Colorado Coalition for the Homeless to our audience. I'm going to transition really quickly to Andrew Foley so folks get to know his perspective. And Andrew is the Associate Director of Development over at Jonathan Rose Companies, which is a leading developer of affordable and mixed income housing. The firm has completed over $3.2 billion in development since 1989. And Andrew's role is very much managing projects in the early stages of development and actively working on several large multi-phase projects in various states throughout the country. He's also overseen the Jonathan Rose Company's Rose Votes initiative, which is getting more and more of their residents registered to vote. And that's what he'll be talking about today. Andrew, I'll turn it over to you to share a little bit more about who Jonathan Rose Companies is and who your residents are and how you've engaged them on elections up to now.
Thanks, Joey, and thanks for your continued leadership on this work. It's really important, and we're happy to be involved. As you mentioned, so we are developers, owners, and property managers of green, affordable, and mixed-income housing across the country. We have nearly 15,000 units under ownership across 18 states and the District of Columbia. And we believe in building communities of opportunity. We believe that housing is a platform for delivering a range of programs, health, education, economic development programming that improves the lives of our residents. And so we track our impact in a number of ways. And one of those ways is through measuring our civic engagement of our residents. So voting and participating in democracy is something that our founder, Jonathan Rose, believes deeply in. And we kicked off our efforts during the last midterm elections in 2018 to really test a range of strategies, which we look forward to talking a little bit more about today, to promote voter registration, voter engagement, voter education, really with an eye towards this upcoming election. And so we are looking forward to continuing to broaden what we do at our own properties, but also hopefully work in partnership with other providers in the industry to collectively work to help low-income people engage and vote.
That's great. Can I ask, how did this conversation get started at your organization? What was the sort of driving idea behind this new involvement, and why have you invested so many resources toward getting the renters registered to vote?
It's a great question, and one of our core values as a company is nurturing the common good. So we believe as landlords, as developers, we have not only an opportunity, but really an obligation to do what we can to remove barriers to the polls. So it's something I know that as a company we've talked about for a while, and then I think in 2018 we realized this was an opportunity to really engage and work to identify a program that could help with voter participation. So it's a core belief of our company, and something we're excited to continuing to grow upon.
That's great, Andrew. And I'm sorry if I'm making you repeat yourself. How many total rental homes does Jonathan Rose Companies own and manage?
Roughly 15,000 units.
15,000, so not that many in the end. Being sarcastic, of course. But I'm wondering, in your efforts in 2018, how many of those properties across how many states and cities were you able to do some of the rose votes engagement? Do you think you were able to meaningfully engage at all properties or just a handful, and how were that handful selected?
That's great. Great question. So, in 2018, we decided to do a pilot first. We believe in testing things and experimenting before we roll things out on a broader scale. So, in 2018, we chose 30 of our properties across 7 states, representing about 5,600 households. So these were properties in Michigan, Colorado, Connecticut, New York and New Jersey, Ohio, really just based on where we had a lot of support of our community managers, but also our resident service coordinators. We wanted to be broad in our outreach. And we also partnered, one of the key things we did was for this pilot, we partnered with the League of Women Voters, who is really just, in our view, a best-in-class provider of voter registration, but also voter education, and a trusted partner. And so yeah, it was a great first step, and now we're looking to really continue to scale up our activities and do more for the general election.
That's great. Kathy, I'll ask you a similar question. How many housing units do you operate at Colorado Coalition for the Homeless? And are you able to conduct your voter engagement efforts sort of comprehensively across all of your service locations and housing locations? Or have you done, similarly to Jonathan Rowe's companies, more of a pilot in recent years?
Yeah, it's interesting because we have had the opportunity to do voter registration both on our own properties, but it is also in our partner shelter system. So as I mentioned before, we own and operate 19 housing developments. Those vary in size and scope in terms of what kind of community space they have. But in every single one of our properties, we make voter registration information available, so on community boards and through our front desk staff. And then we have volunteers who will go to individual properties on certain days and sit in the lobby and work with people on voter registration and or filling out those pledge to vote cards. And then we also have 2 locations in the downtown Denver area, one being the Stout Street Health Center. So we're also a healthcare provider delivering integrated healthcare. We have a large lobby where we will register folks that are coming in to receive healthcare services on that full range: primary health, behavioral health, vision, dental, and pharmacy services. And we have a lot of engagement at the health center because people will be waiting for appointments, or they'll be waiting to pick up their prescriptions, and they'll wander over to the table to maybe pick up a granola bar, and the next thing you know, they're getting registered to vote. And so I think that's one of the places where we tend to have the most engagement. And then we also have a location downtown where we do walk-in appointments to connect people to supportive services and housing resources. And so this is a place where people who are looking for services or looking for resources can come in. They can have an appointment with a case manager, or they can just walk in. And because, again, they might be waiting, for a period of time before they can meet with that case manager or that housing counselor, they'll engage with our volunteers to talk about, what voting opportunities might be coming up, and whether they are registered. And we also have partnerships with some of the shelter facilities, and we can go into those locations. And also, while people are checking into shelter or waiting in the lobby, they can work with our volunteers to make sure they're registered. If they're not, we get them registered. If they are, then we get them to sign a voter pledge card and give them the dates of the election and let them know how they can either get their mail-in ballots in or go to the polling places to vote on election day.
Kathy, I want to follow up on your use of the term volunteers here. I'm interested to know to what extent Colorado Coalition for the Homeless is involving staff at these facilities, or to what extent is the project or the actual labor behind registering these voters, to what extent is that entirely driven by volunteers? And if significantly, how do you recruit volunteers for that effort? Are there particular community groups that you partner with, or do you just sort of recruit volunteers specifically for voter engagement?
So we start our voter registration process with staff, largely my team. So we're a very small but mighty team. There's 5 of us. And then we start to recruit across our organization. So the Colorado Coalition for the Homeless employs about 620 individuals. And so we're able to pull from staff who know that it's very important to have our residents and clients registered to vote, to go to these locations and, build on the relationships that they might already have. We also work with our Consumer Advocacy Board, which is a board of people that have lived experience, have come from situations of homelessness, and might be living in some of our properties. And they will do outreach and education with their colleagues, either on specific properties or through the board. We work from an organizational perspective. We've been working with our civic engagement roundtable. Some states refer to these as their C3 roundtables. They've helped us with some technical assistance, with some technology needs, and helping us identify people maybe through the van, so that when we get people registered, they can get put back into the voter action network. We get a little bit of funding from our Community Resource Center, which is an organization part of the Voter Participation Project, to actually collect information about voter registration and voter cards. But largely the efforts are led by staff who volunteer or consider it to be part of their job because they're advocating on behalf of clients and residents. And then over time, we've been able to build a network of volunteers who are really engaged in voter registration, really see the value in making sure that everyone, gets counted and has a chance to vote. And so those volunteers can be residents with us, they can be clients of ours, or just advocates on the issue.
That's really great. And congrats on being able to develop such a large volunteer network on this issue. Andrew, the question of staff support for this work is one that you and I have explored in the past. And I think one of the things that people listening to this conversation might be wondering is, if we at our organization wanted to get all of our residents registered, how would we find the time to do that? And how have you sort of worked through this question at Jonathan Rowe's companies? Have you found that staff on site at properties are available, or are they lacking capacity and volunteers are necessary? What has your process been for figuring out how to sort of identify and deploy the actual labor in voter engagement?
Right. Well, as any housing providers on this call know, we put a lot of responsibility on our community managers and our resident service coordinators. So day in and day out, these folks are dealing with a lot and a wide range of programs to continue to operate. And so we've been really mindful of trying to provide as much support from our home offices as possible. So we've convened a group across both our New York, Cleveland, and West Coast offices to try to provide some more back-end support, just to make the lives of our resident service coordinators and community managers, who we found really are passionate about this as well. But everything that we can do to make their lives easier to implement voter engagement. And I think that's one of the opportunities that we see with the Housing Providers Council, is that not only are the barriers at the property level there, but I think anyone on this call who has explored how do you get more involved, particularly if you're in multiple states, there's a kind of myriad of issues that you have to get up to speed on. And so I think one of the things we're focused on, particularly this round, is how do we create some of those tools so that providers who want to opt in can do so without reinventing the wheel or climbing a pretty steep learning curve to get to that work. But so we have resident service coordinators at about half our properties. So when we do have a resident service coordinator involved, we really look to them to help be a champion of this work. We've also found at certain properties that residents themselves are passionate about voter participation and engagement. So it really does range. We found that we did explore working with the League of Women Voters, who has a vast volunteer network, and we found there to be some great matchmaking between the volunteers at the local league chapters and our properties, and some relationships that have begun because of that work that have continued on throughout the year. So it takes many forms.
So my next question is actually, I think, to both you, Andrew, and Kathy, which is really, I've asked about sort of who's providing the labor, who's staffing up this project. You know, is it property staff, is it volunteers? But I'm also interested in how this issue and this work manifests in sort of day-to-day work. And so an example might be, have you instituted voter registration as part of lease-up packets, and the idea that when somebody moves into a new home, they probably live in a new legislative district or aldermanic district, they need to update their voter registration.
Right.
Has that been part of lease-up documents? Or Kathy, at the shelters you work at, is it part of an intake process of any kind? How are you sort of working it into just sort of the regular flow of interaction with low-income people?
It's a really important topic, and we're actually right in the middle of rolling out voter registration in all of our leasing and income certification work at the moment, because we think in terms of high impact moves that a provider can make, just incorporating it into the pile of paperwork that as a new resident you fill out. Many voters don't know that they have to re-register in most states when they change their address, and so we also know there's folks in the coalition who are working to make this the law, which we support. We're one of the we're committed to doing it voluntarily, and hope other providers will join as well in doing so. But it's really just the barriers are very easy to overcome. It's we think a real no-brainer in terms of how to really just increase voter registration at properties, just to incorporate it into your lease-up packages.
And Joey, I love this question because you did provide a little bit of some of these questions in advance for us to think about. And so I went and spoke with some of our intake coordinators and our case managers and our advocacy folks. And this is not something that we're doing as part of our intake process or part of our lease-up documents, but everybody was really excited about the possibility of doing it. And I think, from the very base level, just starting with, are you registered to vote, or have you updated your voter registration now that you are, living in a new address, will be our very first step. But I would love for us to figure out a way to make it part of our intake process, and to make sure that people know that if they, aren't getting registered to vote at the time that they're filling out all their paperwork, that there will be opportunities on the properties during our voter registration drive for them to update that registration or to, register for the first time. So got us thinking, and definitely figuring out how we can make this process easier for all of our residents.
That's great. I'm really glad that process is underway, and I hope more organizations are thinking about that right now. So for any of you listening or participating, definitely start thinking about making voter registration just part of the day-to-day interactions, because once you have that as just regular operations, it's easy to sort of give your residents a voice moving forward. Kathy, I want to ask you, or actually this is a question, I suppose, for both you, Kathy and Andrew. When we talk about the reasons low-income renters or people who are homeless vote at lower rates, we talk about some of the things I mentioned earlier. They might be behind locked apartment buildings, or maybe they work unconventional schedules, and so they don't get addressed by some of the same mailers or door-to-door campaigns that are trying to register voters. But another significant barrier, of course, is so many low-income people have given up on conversations about the community getting better or about things improving, because very often their own condition is pretty bad and not getting better, right? So I wonder, how do you engage low-income renters or residents who are apathetic toward voting and apathetic toward conversations of change. Is this an obstacle you found? And if it is an obstacle, how have you worked to overcome it?
So I can start with that. Yeah, it is absolutely an obstacle. We are helping people manage crises every day, and they often feel so left out of the conversation regarding, the systems that have, kept them from staying housed, kept them from getting housing in the first place. That might all the barriers to accessing employment or to accessing services and resources just do oftentimes make a lot of the folks that we're working with apathetic and thinking that they don't have a voice. And so we generally start all of these conversations with, I am sure there is something that you would like to change, or there is a system that you see as being totally inefficient and ineffective for meeting your needs. And the very best way to make those system changes is to participate in the process to develop them. And, sometimes it's as easy as saying you can't complain about things unless you're willing to stand up and make your voice heard on it. Frankly, that doesn't happen in the first conversations that we have with people. Sometimes it takes multiple outreaches or multiple conversations to say, like, how angry are you? How frustrated are you? And aren't you tired of other people making decisions for you? And generally, we can really move people when they start thinking about the fact that all of these policies and all of these systems have been imposed on them, have been just delivered to them, and they've had no opportunity to really make an impact. And sometimes if we're really good and we start talking about resources in a way that, we're able to get you eligible or signed up for a housing voucher today, but this housing voucher may not be available for, the person who comes in after you, unless we make sure that, we're voting for the right people to keep these programs in place. If you make the connection to the resource that they might be receiving that day, sometimes that can also be a motivating factor for people to get involved.
That's a really great point, Kathy. I think sometimes it's really helpful when people have housing that's affordable to them to mention or evoke the people who they know who are on the waiting list, who might benefit from, greater housing supports and so forth. Andrew, has this apathy been an obstacle in your work as well?
It has, and I think we've had a similar experience. My colleague Tim Smith and I, who did a little get out the vote during the midterms. I mean, you do find residents who just are opposed to participation, and we try to be respectful of their decisions not to participate. I think we're in the process right now, actually, of trying to develop a list of tips and tricks, and I've been writing down some of the points that Kathy, you were making, because I think you've got some good talking points there to try to cajole folks back into the process. But, I think, this is not only about this year in particular, not only with the general election, but also with the census, just how important it is this year for everybody to opt in, because this is a year particularly where not having a voice can have lasting implications on your communities. Not just the elections that are before us, but also the census as well. So I think one of the things for folks who are doing this work is just not to lose heart when you hear we ran into a lot of residents who just were like, they just didn't believe, they thought the government was broken, that they couldn't do anything. We found just as many folks who were winnable, folks who hadn't, but you just get into a nice conversation with them and they realize that, maybe I will. And, oh, you got the form right here. And so for every really entrenched, non-participating resident, we find residents who actually just need a little bit of a nudge to get back into the process. So we think it's well worth the effort to be, on the properties doing this work.
And if I can just follow up with one other thing that we talk to people about is, in Colorado, we've made it really easy to vote. So for folks that are housed, everybody gets a ballot. Everybody gets a mail ballot. And so we always try to tell people, if you've got the ballot in hand, why not fill it out? Like, we can provide postage. We can take the ballot and drop it off for folks, only 10 at a time. And then when when they're not housed, we still make sure a ballot is available for them. So if somebody is not housed but registered, they can use an address of the place that they stay with the most frequency. And that can include a street corner or under a bridge, as long as there is a location where they can receive mail. The Colorado Coalition for the Homeless, as well as many shelter providers, will accept mail on behalf of clients. And so as long as they are coming in to get their ballot, we can sit with them while they fill it out, and then we can take it and drop it off for them, or we can mail it to them. And so one of the things that we tell people is, what's the harm in voting? You may think it doesn't matter. You may feel, left out of the system, but there can't possibly be a harm in you actually voting. Whether or not you think it's effective in the long run, why not give it a try? And most people, once they start becoming a regular voter, they stay a regular voter.
Said.
I think those are all really great considerations. And actually, I was about to ask you, what do you do when somebody doesn't have a permanent address? And a question that's sort of on the opposite of that spectrum is, when somebody does have a permanent address, or if someone is retired, or if they're a person who doesn't work because of a disability, or they're a caregiver, sometimes they're not very often in spaces where you interact with them, right? They might not go to the office for regular check-ins and talk to the resident service coordinators and so forth. And so my question to both of you, I'll start with you, Andrew, is what's the best way to get this message to people, knowing that there might be messaging work about apathy and so forth? How do you get the message in their hand? Is it sending something through the mail? Do you employ a newsletter of any kind? Are there mailboxes, or are there opportunities to slide info under people's doors? What's sort of the delivery mechanism of, hey, here's where you vote on Tuesday? How do you get that information to people?
Yeah, we view it as a multi-pronged approach. I think we found one of the most effective ways to do this is to piggyback on other community programming that draws a crowd. So rather than scheduling just a voter registration event and expecting to draw folks out, find the most popular program with the best food and the highest participation, and just put a voter registration table there. We find that often works. Not only just it's more efficient and cost effective to do it that way, but also we find that when you have a crowd, people are just more. There's kind of a positive peer effect that happens when people start talking about the importance of voting. In terms of just more direct door-to-door work, I think we're still trying to figure that out this year. We didn't do any of that work in 2018. I think that's one of the things we want to talk with you, Joey, and others about what are the best practices for not just having signage and opt-in events at our projects, but what are the appropriate things that we can do to more directly engage folks to register or show up on election day.
I think we're in a similar position.
Okay,
like we
great.
would love to figure out how to do more door-to-door work without bugging our residents. But mostly
right.
we want to make sure that we're available, and that's why we have staff and we have volunteers, in the lobbies, and we put information up in all the public spaces, and then we try to catch people as they're, coming in the door and maybe waiting for appointments.
Right. We know of some other providers like National Housing Trust sticks out in my mind as just a really an innovative group that has been out in front on this issue, has done more direct mailings and things like that. I think we're always just trying to strive for what's the most cost-effective approach, and I think we're all collectively trying to figure out what's the right mix, given that there's not only limited resources but limited time that we all have to do this work.
So, Andrew, one of the things you mentioned earlier about engaging your residents on voter activities is, we want to do it in a way that's appropriate. And I wonder, have there been tensions in your previous efforts with residents who are confused or perhaps mistrustful of this is the person who tells me I have to pay rent, and now they're encouraging me to go register to vote? And is there a connection between those two things in their minds, or how do you negotiate a relationship that sometimes is adversarial, but in this case is very much a partnership? How do you sort of work through that?
Yeah. We are fortunate to date. I don't know of any real hostile reactions from our residents in the work that we've done. So I think we've been fortunate, but we've also worked hard to just prepare for that and be mindful that we may be met with skepticism. I think this, again, is not only an issue with voter engagement, but participation in the census. And so we are, I think, are somewhat conservative in what we want to really be careful in how we approach this and not overstep or not do anything that could undermine the work we're doing overall. I'm happy to say in the work that I've done directly with my partners, I think a lot of residents are just happy to see people show up on the property and chat a little bit. And I think that you can shape the engagement in a way that doesn't seem like you're a solicitor or somebody who's looking to report on them for something. So far, we've been fortunate to have been well received by our residents. Again, I think it's something that as an industry, we should all be working to develop a standard process and approach. I think under your leadership, Joey, at the coalition, to how do we address some of these issues, because I think there are some legal issues that are in our mind and others, and we all are approaching this work with the best of intentions, but we want to make sure that we don't do anything that inadvertently violates the trust of our residents, but also maybe oversteps what our role as landlords should appropriately be.
So I think I'd like to switch now to some considerations about getting out the vote and making sure people actually turn out to the polls. I think a lot of our conversation up to this point has been on the idea of voter registration and engaging renters on the election and knowing how to vote and so forth. What efforts have you done to make sure people get out the vote and actually turn out on the polls? And I realize, Kathy, this is a little bit of a different question for you, because in Colorado, as you mentioned, nearly everyone at this point votes through the mail. So maybe that makes your get out the vote efforts a little bit different. So I'll turn it over to either of you to share what you do to actually make sure the voters you've registered get there and that they are in fact counted on election day.
Well, I can say that leading up to an election, we definitely remind people that they should be getting their ballots and that they should fill their ballots out. And if they don't want to, take their ballot in or mail their ballot in, then we can do that for them in some limited ways. One person is only allowed to drop off 10 ballots at a time. So we have to kind of divide and conquer if we're taking that approach. But we still have a lot of people who just like to vote on election day. And that's never going to change, no matter what processes I think we put in place at the state level. We've just got people who like to vote and get their sticker. And so we work with our case management staff to make sure that folks can get to the polls if they want to. We have a lot of resources about where polling places are, when they're open, when they're closed. We try to pay attention to our poll trackers to tell us, what lines are looking like at different polling locations. And again, while we encourage people to vote early and through the mail, or even through the 2 weeks prior to actual election day, if anybody comes to us and says, I haven't been able to vote, I really want to vote today, we make sure that we have somebody who can get them there.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, and for us, I mean, we're as I mentioned, we're in 18 states. I mean, happily, many states have adopted an absentee ballot policy without requiring some sort of excuse like I'm traveling or I can't physically make it to the polls. I think we learned last year that we really think there's a real opportunity there to coordinate around absentee ballots and encouraging folks to send that in. So we're thinking about ways to maybe make it a little bit more fun, a little bit more social, just to really because I think in 2018 we showed up at Michigan to a few of our properties, and we got there with we ended up doing a partnership with the League of Women Voters and Lyft, who was very generously offering free rides to the polls with these cards. So we had all these cards. We were all ready to go, and we found out so many people we had talked to on election day had already voted weeks ago by absentee, particularly in our senior properties. But we've learned from that lesson, and I think moving forward, we're going to be very focused, like Kathy, how do we help with residents and remind residents that they can really vote at any time without even leaving their apartment building. We think there's a great opportunity there. I would say that beyond that, the get out to vote, I think finding, we know of some nonprofit organizations that have provided networks for rideshare. I think that the right solution remains elusive to us because it is a very labor intensive effort. And so I think one of the opportunities for on election day or during early voting we're thinking about is, are there ways where we can partner with other providers in specific areas? Because if we have let's say a city where we have 4 properties, even that few properties, it's hard to really get the payback on developing a system where you're providing a standby driver to take people to the polls. We found it's been hard to make that cost effective. But if we are able to really increase the scale and partner up with other providers in the areas in which we are, we think there may be something to that to provide transportation to those folks who just want to vote on election day, as Kathy mentioned.
This question's a little bit off the wall, and I don't expect that either of your organizations have done this, but I'm curious, have you looked into actually making your housing sites or the community rooms at your housing sites polling locations themselves for the neighborhood or for the ward that they exist in?
Yes, and I mean, we're happy and proud that we have a number of our properties that are polling locations. We actually want to write every single one of our supervisor elections office with a letter saying, please, we have a great community room. We would love to participate. Here in New York in particular, I know the supervisor elections are struggling to find places to have polling sites that don't interrupt things like public schools. And there's a lot of times it's the schools that end up doing this work, and with early voting it can become quite disruptive to the normal school day and pick up and drop off. So we think we're trying to be more proactive. It's actually one of the metrics that we measure is the percentage of our properties that are polling sites. And we want to really increase that where we can.
I love that idea. Again, here I am taking maybe more ideas away than I'm offering. But I think that we have a number of sites that also have great community spaces, and I'm not even sure we've ever really thought about what it would look like to have them being polling locations for the community, but I think it could be a great opportunity.
Okay, that's great. So we are running out of time, and I want to at least have 5 minutes for questions from folks. I guess the final question I'll ask the two of you before we open it up to the broader audience is, overall, what has been the reaction of your residents to these efforts, and how do you feel? What's the feedback you're receiving? Is there a better sense of partnership between housing provider and resident? Is there sort of a sense of sort of shared interests in this regard?
Yeah, just briefly, we've just been so delighted by the response of our residents and our employees. And so I think one of the things that I guess we kind of knew we hoped would happen, but we were surprised, is that not only have we helped make a difference in voter impact, but I think the bonds between our properties, the relationships that have developed on our company side have been really great as part of this initiative. So I would just encourage for anybody who's thinking about making an impact to also measure just the impact of having an initiative like this that brings people from across your company who may step forward saying, I believe in democracy and I want to participate. We've seen a lot of benefit there by our Cleveland office working with our New York office and vice versa, and getting to know our properties better, because unfortunately we don't get to spend as much time on each of our properties as possible. So this has been a great avenue towards that.
Okay, so
I can say.
No, go ahead, Kathy. Sorry.
I was just going to say, people, even if they're resistant to the idea that they should be regular voters, once they become regular voters, they often come back to us and tell us how meaningful it has been to them, that they're paying attention more, they feel more engaged, and then they even want to volunteer with us to get other people registered.
Great.
Okay, so I'd like to turn it over now to anyone in the audience who has questions. Folks have put a couple of things into the questions box, and Brooke on our team will let us know which questions we have.
Great, thanks. We have one question here from Michael. What advice would you have for getting out the vote in more rural locations?
Oh, good question. Believe it or not, when we looked at where we've across our properties and which site, particularly on Get Out the Vote, we found that in a lot of our more urban locations, that a polling place is just around the corner, less than a mile walk. And so we actually, in 2018, realized that it's actually in more rural locations where distance to polling sites may be greater, and where there may be less opportunity to engage them in other ways, where where you could have a higher impact. So I think it's rural locations in particular that could benefit from more engagement. And I would turn to, and I hope whoever asked that question is going to sign up for the Housing Providers Council so that we could all work together to help figure out what works best for your properties.
And I can just add that we have one location in southeastern Colorado that is in a very rural area. It's a residential recovery community. And we make sure that during our voter registration drive that we go down there at least twice to do voter registration. And then we usually kind of empower a couple of the members on that campus to work with people to make sure that their ballots are getting in and that they're getting to the polls if they want to vote on that day. So again, a specific property in a rural area, but I agree we probably could really focus in on how to do some rural outreach better.
This is Joey. I'd just add to that, I've done some campaigning in rural areas in the past, and definitely the best way to go about Get Out the Vote is to get ahead of it and encourage as many residents as possible to ask for absentee ballots, because letting the Postal Service do your Get Out the Vote is certainly a lot easier than doing it all in one day. But to do it all in one day, it usually involves the small investment of renting a van and having a volunteer driver. I've done this at campuses for both universities and housing, and it's just, putting some notices in common spaces that the shuttle will depart to the polling location every 2 hours. You can find the van here, like that kind of thing, is really the best way to do it and make sure that people get to the polling location. The other thing you can do, because very often, I think you'll be surprised, only a handful of people in most cases will require this, because a lot of people who traditionally vote, they make a plan to do so. Usually you only have a small number of people who need it. And so you can sort of encourage people to let you know if they need a ride. And then you can schedule something perhaps with Lyft, who was doing free rides 2 years ago, or you can schedule something with volunteer drivers or staff if you can. I think we have one more question at this time.
Yeah. Have there been any moments where you have hosted candidate forums that focus on affordable housing?
Yes. We did for our most recent mayoral race. We partnered with an organization called All in Denver and hosted a pretty large candidate forum. We had, I think, 6 people running at the time, and it was primarily focused on affordable housing. And then prior to the gubernatorial election in 2018, we had all of our candidates out through another partnership at a church, and it was all focused on housing. And it really, I think, like we're seeing in this presidential election, we really started seeing candidates that had housing plans want to come and speak to the public about them, because the media wasn't asking them about them, or it was coming up everywhere, but they didn't have a large forum to propose their plans in. And so providing that platform was, I think, very beneficial to them as well as to us as a community.
Yeah. And likewise, yeah, we host candidate forums. A lot of times that happens at the property level, and we just make it clear to our community managers that it is something that we're open to and encourage, and just making sure that we're also providing equal access to all parties, so that residents know that this is an open forum regardless of their political beliefs. But yeah, we think it's a great way to use our community rooms.
All right, so those are all of our questions. I am going to wrap up really quickly with a couple of announcements. First, we have the remaining third Thursdays at 3 in our podcast and webinar series. I think we will be, in the near term, moving more toward podcasts. Today was, I guess, a hybrid podcast webinar, but they will continue to be third Thursdays at 3. Our next topic will be getting candidates on the record. So that final question turned out to be a perfect segue. We're going to talk about surveying candidates, doing town hall meetings, and conducting candidate forums. And that'll be March 19th at 3 o'clock Eastern Time, followed in April by educating voters and how do we get voters more aware of voting logistics and candidate positions. Finally, I would say we have limited funding to do voter engagement work. Please consider becoming a member of the National Low Income Housing Coalition. My thanks to both Jonathan Rose Companies and Colorado Coalition for the Homeless for being members. And then finally, that's my contact information, and then the website where you can find the housing advocacy organizer for your state at NLIHC. So with that, I just want to extend a hearty thanks to our guest presenters, Kathy and Andrew, who were fantastic. And I hope to see you all on the next webinar or podcast on March 19th. All right. Have a great day, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joey.
Come on.